Welcome, everybody. Good afternoon and also good morning. Over the last 2 years, Gen AI has seen a remarkable lift with new foundational models by leading companies, open source models, and other apps built on top of these models, permeating different spaces in society. And while AI models and agents bring in many sort of advantages, and it has enhanced our capabilities in a lot of ways, this has also endowed us with the capability to create endless streams of like serious sounding artifacts that may actually not have any sort of grounding in expertise. So this is starting to be called the AI slop problem, and it's affecting all parts of society and is likely to get much worse before it gets better. And that's also why we've convened the Slop Conference, and welcome to day two. I'm Diksha, a research associate at Belongg, and Belongg is a social innovation venture that focuses on inclusion. And Sinceriti is a recently launched blockchain-based proof of intention platform that seeks to center human authenticity and intention in a range of settings, such as fundraising, thought leadership, etc. And we wanted to specifically discuss how AI slop functions, how it has evolved, how it's playing out in different sectors, and what it's doing to us and possible paths forward. So in particular, this panel talks about what happens when trust collapses owing to slop and who gets affected the most. So how does this threaten the foundations of democracy, markets, and education, which all depend on like baseline societal trust? So I'll begin by setting the slightly sort of broader context, and then I'll also begin by introducing our panelists. So trust is the invisible infrastructure of a society, right? That every meaningful transaction that anybody undertakes, from a voter trusting a ballot count, to a farmer trusting a welfare scheme is going to work for them, to a citizen trusting that a drafted law was actually written in good faith, depends on a baseline assumption that the information that is mediating this transaction is authentic, right? And that the parties on each side are people who claim to be who they are. But trust also operates across scales. It can be at the micro level where there's an interpersonal exchange, like how do I trust what someone tells me? It can be face to face. It can also occur at like the more meso level, which structures how we interact with specific institutions and organizations. Do I trust the university degree that I have to be credible? Do I trust the policy consultation? And then also at the more macro level, it also underpins the social contract itself, right? We agree to be governed because we trust that governance systems operate on shared information and also accountability. Now, scholars have also talked a lot about like high trust and low trust societies. High trust societies enjoy lower transaction costs, greater civic participation, and also more cohesion. But at the same time, low trust societies tend to exhibit insularity. And by insularity, I mean that there is a retreat to smaller in groups. And that breaks down a lot of reciprocity, and there's a lot of information asymmetry. So when that happens, this can lead to more verification, more surveillance, and also excluding a lot of people who lack the resources to navigate this landscape. So there's also like more in like there's more empirical evidence that also undergrounds this. So for example, like there's a recent report that came out in 2026 called the Edelman Trust Barometer report that talks a lot around how people are now unwilling to trust each other, especially people who come from different backgrounds or different information sources. There's a lesser optimism in general for future generations. There's also like a trust gap between high income and low income respondents, which is also doubling, which shows that the trust in itself is becoming something that is stratified. Now, Edelman also identifies like four big forces that fuel this. So there's economic anxiety, collapse optimism, eroding institutional trust, and the informational crisis. And the latter two are something that generative AI is a distinctive sort of accelerant of. So in this case, AI slop becomes very indistinguishable from authentic human output. And that is what sets it apart from earlier sort of internet pollution like spam, clickbait, or trolling. And it can be generated at scale. And oftentimes it happens without sort of like that underlying understanding that without the underlying understanding that these artifacts are historically signaled. So as a result, this creates like a new axis of inequality and a trust divide where it becomes very difficult to verify what is authentic, what is not, who do I trust. And this becomes a marker of like a new form of information privilege. So this is exactly what we examine for this particular panel. And a quick introduction to all of our panelists. So Dr. Mark Carrigan is a senior lecturer in education at the Uni of Manchester, where he co-leads the Digital Education Manchester group and serves as an AI fellow at the Institute for Teaching and Learning. He also coordinates the Critical Realism Network while also being active at the Center for Social Ontology. He has authored 9 books, including Generative AI for Academics and Social Media for Academics. And he is a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts as well as a fellow of the Higher Education Academy. Welcome, Mark. So excited to have you on. Then we have Antaraa, who's the founder and CEO of Civis. She's an Ashoka Fellow and is recognized for restoring procedural trust in Indian policymaking. She founded Civis in 2017, a nonprofit platform that enables citizens to co-create laws with the government before they are passed. And she's also been on the Forbes 30 Under 30 Asia list. Civis has worked with India's central government and also state governments, and 5 organizations now replicate the model across India. And there's also early implementation happening in Taiwan. And her broader work spans participatory governance in slum communities, multi-language chatbot-based civic engagement, and also grassroots nonprofit partnerships for democratic participation. Again, Antaraa, so glad to have you here and to join the conversation. Next, we have Sachin, who, as he had also already mentioned, he's a co-founder of Agami, an organization that focuses on innovation, entrepreneurship, and collaborative action to transform systems of law and justice. He served as the executive director of Ashoka Changemakers and has founded Law School Tutorials, Rainmaker, and The Inclusive Planet, and has been honored as a 2020 Inc. Fellow. At Agami, he's built the Agami Prize and the Justice Maker Mela to convene justice innovators, and also leads the Open Nyaya mission, developing AI public goods for access to justice. And then, again, so happy to have you here, Sachin. And then we have Dr. Juni, who is a senior research associate at the Khazana Research Institute, that is Malaysia's nonprofit policy research institute. Her current research interests include digital rights and AI governance in the context of Southeast Asia and Malaysia. And she also runs an online project called Slow Stories in/around AI to collect stories in Southeast Asia regards to AI and work. And some of her prominent work includes visualizing societal arms of AI towards a new AI constitutionalism. And she's also published with the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Yeah, okay. So I think we have a really, really lovely panel here. So I'll just jump into our questions. So the first question that I wanted to broadly pose, and this is something that we wanted everybody to come in on, was that not all trust is the same, right? And it exists at interpersonal, institutional, and systemic levels. And AI slop seems to be corroding all 3 of them, but through like different channels and mechanisms. So what is specifically breaking in your domain, and how is AI slop deepening pre-existing trends or doing something qualitatively new? So I would like to first invite Mark. So Mark, you've already sort of talked about how generative AI can be like an engine of mistrust, right? Where there is this deeper suspicion around people who are using generative AI and what the burden of proof looks like in terms of who is um, who is creating what kind of artifacts. So at a philosophical level, what happens to trust when the cost of simulating authenticity really drops to near zero? And is this something that you're seeing at an institutional level, or is it something that is more fundamental about how we sort of relate to one another?
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to talk particularly about the UK context because there's a risk when we talk about AI slop that we turn it into a global story about technology. And what I really like about the framing for this event is that we're focusing on relational specificity. How the technology plays out is deeply context dependent. And so, while I think there are converging trends in international higher education, I'm going to speak particularly about the UK because it's the one that I've been preoccupied by for the last few years. Well, I think we're seeing a multidimensional crisis of trust. It's not just in the relationships within higher education, but also how stakeholders in wider society see higher education and particularly see degrees. And so in the everyday life of a university, some relationships are really key. The relationships between staff and students, the relationships between students and the relationships between staff. And I believe we can see a breakdown of trust in all of those dimensions simultaneously. So, for example, what I've termed the Great Assessment Panic, many academics believe that they can perceive the use of AI in a kind of deep, substantive way, whereas I think all they're really picking up on is superficial polishing, where someone is using an LLM to improve the kind of fluency, the style of the text. And it's not possible to see the kind of deeper reality of whether there's been a wholesale outsourcing. But we see it in reverse as well. So there's a lot of cases beginning to emerge of students taking issue with staff use of LLMs. That use is often not at all transparent. And much as with student use, it varies in quality. I've written a guidebook about how academic staff can use LLMs in thoughtful and creative ways. I believe it can be done. But it can also be done in very problematic ways where someone uses the system to avoid thinking rather than using it to supplement their thought. And I think we're going to see more students, probably rightly, feeling very critical of staff who are using LLMs haphazardly to, say, produce teaching materials at short notice. But I think as well as this breakdown of trust, we have to distinguish between the perception of the problem and the problem itself. So, as I've said, too many academic staff assume superficial polishing is inherently a form of cognitive outsourcing. Likewise, I worry that students might come to see any sign of LLM use as interchangeable. So, if a teacher is using an LLM to produce slides, that means they're not thinking about the material. My use of LLM to produce slides really helps me teach because I'm bad at thinking in terms of slide design. I think I produce better slides because of the LLM, but crucially, the ideas and the framework are coming from me. And I think because we can't see that cognitive workflow, it's very easy to get lost in these kind of quite loaded judgments. And so I think it's not just the problem of slop which causes relational damage, it's the perception there is a problem. And so I think there clearly is a thing called AI slop that we need to talk about, but we also need to talk carefully about what we mean when we use that term and how it circulates, because as it becomes a kind of ready-to-hand term that people can draw on to make sense of events, I think it can link together low quality contributions and outputs in a new way. But those low quality contributions and outputs obviously already existed. The world was full of bad, thoughtless, rushed work to begin with. This isn't creating that, it might be amplifying it. But we need to understand what we're doing culturally and interpersonally when we deploy this category to make sense of these events. So I spend a lot of time thinking about AI slop and using the term, but I'm also slightly nervous about the term. I think this is a very powerful category we're using, and we need to treat it very cautiously.
I think that makes a lot of sense. I think also in the broader context of the fact that, like, let's say Merriam-Webster just came out with slop as like the word of the year in 2025, right? Now it's entering the sort of local sort of colloquialisms, right? And so how are we using that word, and the power of that word also means a lot. And I really like what you said about relational specificity when we're talking about this. And that is also the point where I would love to bring Junie in for this, because Junie, your work in like visualizing societal harms of AI, you've talked a lot about how AI also damages like connections between people, and it's not just, harming individuals or groups in particular. And also how, the case in Myanmar where platform amplified content actually broke social ties at a societal scale. So do you think that AI slop could be doing something similar? And also, do you think that, like, from your own research at the KRI, do you think that this is coming from a more relational space, or an information quality space?
So, on the societal harms piece, at that point, I was basically trying to put the spotlight on broken relationships within society, because I felt that we were focusing too much on individual harm of AI. So, I think that since then, of course, at that point, generative AI was at a very, very early stage. And for Myanmar, for instance, it was more on like amplification of this sort of content that was very hate speech filled and all of that, and the propaganda and everything. It still needed people to generate them, right? And now it's just become extremely cheap to do that. So that already has, I feel, become hate speech and all that is a problem, but I think that now the silent problem is more the sheer amount of noise. And the problem of, for instance, now it's not so much about making sure that people don't trust the wrong things, but making sure that people trust at all. So I think that's actually quite like a shift in the problem. And like when you ask if it's a relational problem or an information quality problem, I think that this is interrelated, right? So if we talk about information quality, what aspect are we talking about? If it's talking about, say, accuracy, with the improvement of LLMs, it becomes more and more accurate. Possibly it will still hallucinate, of course it will, but it becomes a little bit better than before. But if we're talking about authenticity, that's a completely different thing, right? The provenance of where this content came from, who said what, and a lot of times who said it actually is more important, right, than what was being said. So then to me, because I have a background in communication, everything is a communication problem. And therefore, and communication is always a relational problem because you're trying to communicate from one to another or one to many. So for that, I think that it is still a relational problem, right? So at an interpersonal level, communication itself relies on accurate, authentic, reliable information sent and received by both parties, right? So AI slop basically just adds a lot of noise because you don't know if the person meant the mistake or if it was AI, or if you're even talking to a person, you know, and the act of communicating with generative AI also sends some other signals of their own, which is that the person who is speaking or who's writing does not care enough to invest time and energy to communicate in their own words or creativity, right? So hence it has a relational impact. Trust is impacted. So at the societal level, really, it's just volume, speed, just like the level of tsunami that comes at you, whether intentional or not. And it just then affects our ability to process all that information. And therefore, you know, it affects our abilities to have like a common baseline of shared beliefs and assumptions. And that is also a relational problem. So lastly, I think higher quality information just it doesn't solve the problem of where the information came from, whether it came from a human or a machine. So it doesn't solve some fundamental problems of whether to trust or not, because the more say convincing it is, actually it makes everybody harder, makes it harder for everybody to decide what to trust, whether it came from, you know, where it came from. Yeah, thank you.
No, thank you so much for that. I think like the specific you know question that you were posing around whether or not we actually get people to trust at all, and also like the specificity around just looking at how like in the communication space in particular, like how does that affect like our ability to believe whether somebody is being authentic, is really, really important. And I also wanted to sort of bring Antaraa in for this specifically, which is that like your work has been focused on looking at the relationship between the citizens and the state. So like we're moving a little bit more from the interpersonal to the slightly more institutional level. So where you are creating conditions where like both sides need to believe that there is genuine engagement, right? Like as a citizen, I need to believe that there is genuine engagement from the state. As a person who's in the state, I need to believe that there's genuine engagement from the citizen. So as AI makes it possible to simulate sort of civic engagement at scale, how are you thinking about what it means for that like relationship? And also like, is it shifting from like, is the challenge shifting from getting people to the table, and also just like perhaps is the table itself compromised?
Super. Thanks so much, Diksha. And I'll just kind of also briefly touch upon your last question around what is breaking and how AI slop may break certain vulnerabilities. I just want to share a slightly different outlook, which is that while technology has always pushed civic engagement to its boundaries, it has also yielded a lot of wonderful innovation that has brought us closer together as people, right? Today, it's AI that we're talking about, and on other days, it's, let's say, the Gutenberg's printing press, right, which moved us from aristocracy to democracy. It was a technological intervention. Everybody was very suspicious about it, but it worked. And it brought us something better. So I do want to paint that picture that it is something that has the potential to also bring us together and to close those gaps. Coming to your second point, And going a little bit deeper into what I personally define as trust worth building, and this is just again from my perspective and point of view, is procedural trust. The reason being that in my experience, there are different kinds of trust. Like, let's say, for example, I say that, okay, this person I know, so I trust that they will get the job done. And in politics, that plays out quite frequently, where you actually look at, okay, this person is from my family or from my broader community group, so my voice will be represented in parliament. The other, and that's a little harder to design for. That can actually, in some ways, be an erosive factor of trust. The other factor is actually procedural trust, where you just say that no matter what the outcome, if I know that the input, the process, and the output was fair and it was transparently done, I'm okay. Right. So even if the policy perhaps doesn't reflect my personal voice, as long as I know that the process was fairly done, I'm all right to go with whatever the larger sort of view is, right? So when you look at procedural trust, and now I'll come to the crux of your question. When you look at procedural trust, I think it becomes really important to see AI as a tool for optimization, and not as a tool for corrosion. The reason that I say this is that Mark also mentioned social media. Um, Social media gave us the first time an opportunity to have a larger table, right? AI is now giving us the opportunity to converse at that table more and more frequently, by using it in a very thoughtful, deliberate, and intentional way. So yes, there are opportunities for AI to erode certain systems. But here, in fact, and especially in the Indian context, I find that it's also very empowering, because somebody who may not have had, let's say, the linguistic ability or the confidence to draft a formal letter and send it as a representation, is now being able to do it thanks to ChatGPT, right? So it is very, very empowering. Yes, it needs guardrails, but we'll figure that out along the way. We've always been good at it.
Thank you so much, Antaraa. I think like this is this I think definitely sort of nuances like the conversation a lot more in terms of like looking at what thoughtful, deliberate, and intentional like usage of AI can be, and also just the broader point around like how it can even democratize access to a lot of these systems that otherwise might have been gatekept, right? And so then this is again like a great sort of entry point for Sachin to perhaps come in, where Sachin, like for example, you've been looking at how people experience law and justice in your work at Agami, and also specifically with like the OpenAI work, you've also been seeing how AI sort of essentially transforms this like sort of information environment that justice depends on, and you're sort of looking at both like sort of like the democratization of it, and then at the same time you might also be encountering problems around like what the information quality in and of itself is. So could you like maybe talk a little bit about if there is a tension there?
Yeah, I'm, definitely there's no doubt about the fact that there is a big risk to institutional trust. Is this something I can, and in justice, almost everything runs on the trust, right? If you look at formal justice institutions, they run on trust and belief. A very good example is what's happening today with the textbook issue that happened, right? Where the class 8 textbook actually had a statement that the judiciary is corrupt, right? And that is a battle that can be fought at the level of, the crazy thing is that it's not just at the level of the textbook. There could be a much more subtle battle fought in terms of slop, not even fake slop, but showing the courts as inept, showing judges as inept, showing people as frustrated. So look, there's a whole world of risks that are there. There's no doubt, institutional risks for sure. And but I want to kind of indulge one thought. And what Antaraa was saying also about the fact that at the same time, we have been very excited about AI because we have believed that we were at such a poor starting point that if you create solutions at least you will get information to people. At least you will get certain level of agency. So you have to understand the start point. If the start point is zero agency, and you're providing information and you're providing form filling and all, you are definitely doing something. But I think that, and I think that that's the right way, right? You have to be optimistic. You have to trust that you can solve these problems. But I think that we are confronting this, we need to go back a little into history. And the reason why, only when we look at the broader historical arc do we realize what the challenge is. And the challenge is that, early 20th century, Rabindranath Tagore, one of India's greatest poets, he put up a beautiful quote. He said that we had, no doubt, India witnessed many kings that were ruling them, but India had a lot of local self-government, at least till 250 years back. So many villages, they didn't even know who the king is, even though they fell under the tax collection of that. Now they had their local self-government. Then the British did something around 200 years back, around 180 years back, that fundamentally changed this. The British realized that it was too much friction to allow for local self-government to be the model and then to negotiate purchase of commodities. So then they substituted the local self, they basically created the bureaucratic service, the Indian administrative, so the Indian civil service originally. And what started happening over 100 years was massive top-down governance and centralization of governance. Even with regard to schools, local schools went away. Why am I bringing this point? I'm bringing this point because there was a steady deterioration of the trust intermediaries and the trust mechanisms at community level. Please tell me right now, how is it that on my neighborhood WhatsApp group, I have so much venting, but there's not a single group of people who can come together and solve the problem? Please tell me, why are we constantly seeing this individualized action? And the favorite word that we've taken is individual agency. But individual agency is so hard to sustain without societal agency. And societal agency is almost impossible to sustain without societal trust. So the reason why SLOP is a problem for us, can I call that out, is not because of AI inherently, but because we are looking away from solving the problem of social institutions, from genuine local governance. If you had a ton of social institutions, and if you had strong societal trust mechanisms that used to be there, flawed as they might be, you would be able to intermediate this much better. So you can't solve the empowerment problem just individually, because then you will get all these the risk issues also. You have to solve it both individual agency and societal agency. So you have to rebuild the societal trust, but it's a messy task. We want to do it again top down. We don't want to do it the hard way. And that's why we're coming back on these same problems.
Yeah, I think that's definitely like a really, really important point that you talked about, which is like the erosion of like trust intermediaries, and also like what would like building a trust infrastructure even look like, right? And where do we even start building that trust infrastructure, keeping in mind that like there has been, and it's not like an AI problem in particular, but more just the fact that there is the systematic erosion of trust everywhere. So something that like I think that it also gives us a good sort of segue into like what we also wanted to talk about next, is that now that we're sort of like trying to unpack the problem of like trust as something that is eroding. So then if trust is something that we consider as infrastructure, then there's also like a breakdown of it that's happening. And then that breakdown also doesn't really affect everybody very equally, right? And at the same time, when all of this is happening, the ability to be able to signal that you're somebody who's trustworthy is also something that is then becoming a form of capital. So in that sense, who do you think, could be more increasingly exposed to having a lack of that capital to signal in the first place, right? That I am a trustworthy person, and you should like I am a trustworthy institution even. So I would really like to bring like Antaraa in on this also for because civic engagement focuses a lot on people trusting that like their participation matters, right? And that the communities that actually need their voice in policy are often people who may have to navigate like a polluted sort of information environment. Like first we're talking about bringing information to people, but then at the same time this next step could also be that we're bringing them to a space where they're having good quality information. So then how when people encounter misleading AI generated content about laws or government schemes, like, the damage isn't just misinformation, but it's also just like how it can lead to some withdrawal of participation. So then what are you seeing from like your experience?
Right. So thanks, Diksha. I think, it's a little early to say about the withdrawal of participation. But what I can share is that essentially the challenges that plague misinformation and also the uh, sort of nuances of solving for that are very much real even in civic participation, right? What my sense is, and I am, as everyone will soon find out over the next 90 minutes, I'm a bit of an optimist. What my sense is that we are creating at the same time also equal channels for the filtering of sensible and trustworthy information. So the OpenAI project that Sachin mentioned and the work that Agami does also very closely looks at how do we create enough information about beneficiary schemes, how do we create enough information and infrastructure for people to apply to those things. And in my experience, we have been riding the misinformation wave. I think where we should be concerned more is around digital fraud, around deep fakes specifically. Unfortunately or fortunately, however you see it, policy making is not as attractive as politics when it comes to actually generating some of this fake content, right? You also have a single source of truth, which is very easily available in the public domain. So I think there we are not seeing too many shifts as of yet. But at the same time, as I articulate this, that single source of truth becomes more and more important, no matter if it's a policy document or any sort of bank scheme or anything else that we're getting roped into.
I think that this is also like a great sort of space to perhaps also bring in like Juni, because her work also looks at around how, like, so I think what you touched upon is really important, because like in the sense that there is like, while there not may not be that many shifts at the same time, and misinformation is a problem that's happening, I think what also perhaps amplifies this erosion of trust, and I'm just thinking out loud, is also just there is information asymmetry, right? Like there is fundamentally, like in terms of like, especially if you're looking at the relationship between people and an institution, there is an information asymmetry that's happening, and that is what we're trying to essentially bridge for. So like Juni's work also, like at Carnegie specifically, looks at how, like algorithmic management also concentrates a lot of power through information asymmetry. So I think I also wanted to bring you in, because like there are also communities that face a lot of digital exclusion. So do you think that this problem can get amplified, or is it a compounding effect for communities that have already faced that and now they're also facing further like lack of access to reliable information?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, this is not really related to the algorithmic management work that I've done, but I think we've really seen in Southeast Asia that, like, for instance, those who have been excluded from digital spaces and are slowly catching up, they have less experience, let's say, and therefore less literacy or less time to get the level of literacy that they need. And of course, there's also the language problem and all that. So there's definitely this learning curve to try to distinguish between what is real and what is fake. And this will have, of course, ramifications on their online safety, a key concern being scams. So the level of the rise of scams is just like pretty scary at this point in the region. And interestingly enough, I also wanted to like sort of draw from this recent thing that we have in Malaysia, which is this discussion on banning under 16s from social media. So one of the pushbacks is that, so you're gonna keep that technology away from children, and then when they turn 16, just open the door, and then, then they have no immunity at all, So the thing is, the argument there is that we should actually be trying to build a safer, social media space, internet space for all, and not, just have this this solution of shielding people, like excluding them, basically. And then eventually they have a problem for, literacy. So the other thing I wanted to bring up is AI detection tools. Because they're definitely less effective in the global majority because of the lack of training data, for instance, in low resource languages, for instance. So, I mean, we've already seen that facial recognition technologies, for that matter, has a higher error rate, right, for those who are non-white. So AI detection, where right now we're trying to battle, in trying to differentiate what is true and what is not at a large scale. I think that is somewhere where we're failing the populations that are already vulnerable due to the lack of experience. And then the tools are also not working as well. Yeah, so I'll stop there.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think what I wanted to then perhaps talk about, and I think this is just something that I'm seeing across from the different bits of conversation that we're having, is that we're talking a lot around misinformation, fraud, and also what lack of access to reliable information, or just even access to the wrong kind of information, can really do. So I also wanted to sort of pivot to another question, which is that AI slop in specific is something that can also be weaponized. So then in particular, there's this new phenomenon that's called slopaganda, where now a lot of people are using slop to create power narratives, or specifically around political, around specific political incentives. And a lot of times, there's a lot of manufacturing of a lot of this content, and it's cheaper, scalable, and sort of harder to attribute than traditional propaganda. So then what does that sort of mean for not just democratic participation in general, but also just more everyday sort of civic processes? So I wanted to ask Mark, and invite Mark into this conversation, because you've also written a little bit around shadow mobilization, astroturfing. So how do you think that AI generated political content may compare to earlier forms of misinformation? Because we've been sort of drawing that thread between misinformation existing pre-AI to now what is on the ground. And also, do you worry that it's also it might have a bigger democratic cost?
Yeah, this is what worries me the most. In early 2024, I was teaching a class on technology and disinformation. And because there were so many elections taking place around the globe, I got very apocalyptic about what might happen later on that year. And I think I freaked out some of my students. And I was really pleased that I was wrong. I thought we would see large-scale political violence internationally in 2024, driven by mass use of this technology. And yet it was relatively peripheral in most of these elections. And I think that's really interesting because when the incentive was there, the affordance was there, I still don't understand why it didn't diffuse more than it did. And the best explanation I've been presented with was mutually assured destruction. So rationally, political actors were unwilling to begin to use this en masse because if they were seen to do it, it could escalate a cycle which everyone recognized could destroy the democratic deliberation. And I think that's clearly part of it, but I don't think it's a sufficient explanation. Because since then, obviously, the capacity to produce this material has only increased. And so, we see video channels filled with AI slop, but it's mostly engagement farming, I think, even when it has political content. It's not being produced, for the most part, for political purposes. It's designed to get clicks and attention because you can run a kind of a reasonable online video business with very small overheads. And so I think it's going to grow. What worries me the most is persuasive use of LLMs. And so the literature on this is mixed, and there's a lot of experimental evidence that shows many people, such as myself, are maybe overestimating the persuasive capacity of an LLM. But my experience of using them on a regular basis for years is they can be really persuasive because of their capacity to attune to your assumptions and feel like a kind of safe place where you can articulate thoughts and they reflect those back to you with a peculiar kind of power. And how that could be used for kind of mass targeting, I think, is a really interesting and worrying question. So the capacity to use it for these purposes is growing. The incentives are there. And maybe we should be reassured by the fact we're not seeing this used en masse as a repertoire of contention in the way that I certainly in 2024 assumed would be the case. But there's something deeply destructive here, which, if activated and if it spirals, I think meaningfully could make democratic liberation impossible, at least in its current form.
I just had like a small follow-up to that. I think it's also really interesting because it's like we're not seeing it happen en masse, but at the same time, I think we're also seeing it happen from specific actors within the ecosystem that also have influence. Like for example, so then how does that also play into the picture? Just a small follow-up.
Yeah, and so sociologists talk about the repertoires of contention within social movements and kind of organizational activism, where something becomes accepted as the kind of technique we use in political life. And so, yeah, clearly it's happening, but I don't think it's been institutionalized. And I think when it becomes institutionally part of how we do politics, that's when it becomes really destructive. I'm interested in the UK in finding examples of using this on hyperlocal levels. And I think that's a situation where individual actors will not be bound by the same sense of collective logic that state level actors will be. And so I suspect we might see more of this growing at hyperlocal individual levels. But yeah, it's very, very worrying. I mean, this is where the technology could become immensely destructive. I think the safeguards in kind of consumer-focused AI have got better, but equally, my experience of trying this is it's still very easy to get around them. You just have to talk to Claude or ChatGPT and say you're doing a kind of fiction project or you're engaged in creative work and you want it to produce creative materials for you. And most of the time, you can get it to produce whatever you want with a few exchanges.
Yeah, thank you so much for that answer. I think what I also wanted to do is like Sachin, I noticed that you were nodding a little bit. I also wanted to bring you in and also ask like what do you think like how do you think this could particularly perhaps affect like the communities that let's say Agami works with? Because a lot of like what you've been also talking about is like what does the local level of mobilization look like? So what do you sort of think could be concerns there, or what do you think like how could that affect like people's relationship to like justice also more broadly?
So one quick thing on what Mark was pointing out, that the result was not what, I look at Indian society, and I don't, of course, Indian society is very hard to read, but I have a thought process which is, in India, a few years back, of course, everyone remembers Amartya Sen wrote this beautiful book called The Argumentative Indian. But I think you could easily be writing The Cynical Indian, right? The cynical Indian is this thing that for hundreds of years, somebody has been telling me a story of how they are the answer to my upliftment. Okay, and this very deep-seated social thing that I don't trust anybody. I know that and I have actually known of people who have voted for a candidate saying ये तो झूठ बोल रहा है, like this part they are lying, but in the broader scheme of things, we have to select that guy. So there is this deep-rooted kind of thing that whatever you hear, don't trust what you hear. Very deep-rooted, and it comes from the history, right? Naturally, they would be. Think about it. Like everyone from God knows how many hundreds of years has been happening. So one is that I'm curious to know how have people negotiated, like who do they trust and why do they trust? And how is that going to be, how can that be actually a good thing? So why I'm bringing that point is, for the last 3-4 years, little bit of the snake oil, the Kool-Aid has been that the answer is to give people agency by giving them information, giving them tools, and that's going to lift their power, right? But that again does not substitute for strengthening their trust matrix, strengthening their societal, trust intermediaries. Once again, it's a easier solution because the techno bureaucracy that is easier to us is that no, we can empower directly like this. This is how we can do this. So I think that one, to Mark's point, I think it's very interesting. I'm curious to read the study on how Indians trust as a result of the situation. But I'm also I come back to the point that we have to invest now by not seeing AI as a technological shift but a societal shift, and we have to invest in societal innovations that build trust. So it's not just the digital trust investments, it is hardcore local school investment, local self-government investment. Like, why we are so much, again, we get drawn into only discussing it on one parameter, but why aren't we seeing more people saying, I'm investing in these institutions because they deeply develop societal trust? Now, you know why, Diksha, that is relevant to the justice paradigm is because so few people go to the courts. Where do they go? They go to the local representative, they go to the amma or the senior lady in the neighborhood. They go, these are the justice mechanisms. When these are being eroded by default, people will go to court. By default, if you go to court, institutional trust will once again be a vulnerability. But on the other hand, if you are building deep trust, local intermediaries, strengthening that, then you're going to safeguard mediation, local arbitration, rather than thinking the answer is an app that is going to suddenly lift you by individual agency alone into empowerment, which I think is a trap, you know.
Yeah, I really echo what Antaraa also said. Like, this is a really important point around like how do we invest in things that are mediating our trust, right? Like, for example, like a lot of the Edelman report that I was referencing also talks about how trust is something that's brokered. Like so you have different forms of like ways in which trust gets brokered, and there's like different channels through which that also happens. And of course, like information is just one channel through which that process also takes place. And so I also wanted to perhaps like bring Antaraa in because here because like especially because of like what you had been talking about earlier around procedural trust and also facilitating that. Like how do we sort of like and in terms of like how there's like so much in like the civic information ecosystem, right? There's like WhatsApp forwards, there's social media, there's AI generated explainers, there's also like government publications, and there's like so many layers to it. When a citizen may encounter some like sort of new information, like how do we sort of make sure that they're getting like trustworthy civic information like in a sea of noise? And yeah, so just
Right. Thanks so much, Diksha. So, two or three examples that I can share actually around here. One is actually really emphasizing for citizens traceability. And traceability, we can't afford today in today's day and age to just consume content anymore. Like we have to think more critically about it as well, right? So traceability is one of those important factors to make sure that your content is actually coming from a verified and reliable source. Um, the second thing that I want to bring up is some work that the Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology is doing in India, which is where they are trying to encourage, and I think the Prime Minister at the recent India AI Summit brought this up as well. They're trying to encourage social media platforms to have a disclaimer on any AI generated content, right? This means that, I mean, according to current Indian norms, it has to be 10% of the entire screen visibility, which says that this is AI generated content. When you think critically about it, we all use AI in assistive functions as well. Maybe as a scriptwriter, I will use AI to just tighten up the reel. So we need to think about to what extent or degree do we think about declarations. We also need to look at models and from the Indian context, something that the EU has done, something apparently that China has also worked on, in making sure that you have the right guardrails for putting information out. It's a little harder to control once the information is out there, but much, much easier for us to stem and design for at a more deliberate stage. And what's again encouraging is the fact that governments across the world are thinking about it and thinking about, okay, how do we make sure that at least some amount of AI recognition is done by the agency putting out that content as well.
thank you so much. I think this is definitely like a lot to think about in terms of like what does labeling or what does sort of where does platform accountability come into the picture also, like when we're looking at like from like a more like sort of content and information perspective, because a lot of it is consumed over like social media, and we've been having like a conversation around like social media also has a space where a lot of this information is reaching people. Something that I also wanted to perhaps like bring Juni in is a little bit is like how like specifically to bring in like what do you think like in the Malaysian sort of context, which is like multi-ethnic and multilingual, like where is like trust in institutions sort of unique unevenly distributed, and also how does AI generated political content might like carry some risk?
Yeah, so in Malaysia, definitely as a multicultural, multiracial, multilingual country, we are exposed to certain fault lines within society, differences in race and religion. And of course, language is a key issue because different people consume different news in different languages and different biases, different media outlets. You get the idea. So polarization within society is therefore a concern, and radicalization, incendiary posts, and misinformation being amplified, for example, all of that is happening. And I think in Malaysia, actually, I was just doing a mapping of the policy actors the other day for another piece of research, and I realized that there's actually a lot of different ministries that take care of the information ecosystem in Malaysia, notably like the Ministry of Communication, the Home Ministry, of course, the Ministry of National Unity, the Ministry of Tourism, Arts and Culture, because of the arts and culture component, just to name a few. And so it is clearly something that our policymakers care about, even though they don't say that they care about it in one way or another. But to keep, you know, the information environment sort of harmonious, if that, for lack of a better word, is quite important for the country. So I think it's actually really important for Malaysians to sort of develop this level of immunity. Apart from what institutions can bring, right? They will have their literacy programs, campaigns, and things like that. But ultimately, Malaysians need to build that immunity, such as when we're in the pandemic situation, against the content, you know, that they see online, so that they can be fortified against some AI generated stuff, political scams, things like that. Until what you mentioned on like AI labeling and things like that actually catch up. Because I think at this moment, and we've actually been looking at scams, so which is why we are mapping these things out, and we realize that there's actually a lot of campaigns on scams trying to, you know, make sure that people don't get scammed. And how they do it is just to sort of describe different types of scams, how they look like, in hopes that people will see it if they recognize it. But I think that the same level of effort is not happening on in general, right? Every piece of information that you see, how do we simulate, you know, this information and all that, to just inject a bit of that poison, and then have people understand, oh, okay, this is how it could look like. Yeah, so I think that I hope I understand. I mean, your question correctly, and responded appropriately. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely like a really appropriate response. And I think this is also like very helpful to sort of contextualize it in like also across multiple different contexts, right? Because like we have a lot of people coming in from different spaces. So it also helps us to see like what, let's say, modeling in certain spaces in Southeast Asia can look like. And for example, like you mentioned, the ministries around monitoring the information ecosystem, right? And like, for example, we also have specific ministries that are dedicated towards like looking at what is being published, but I don't think it has necessarily caught up to what is coming up in on like online spaces as much, right? So then having something that is around AI labeling has been like a relatively new development, as Antaraa had also mentioned. So I would like to now move to like another segment. So we have like, so now that we've had like this broader conversation from like, you know, the sort of information ecosystem, misinformation ecosystem, and also just like what the stakes are around like encountering misinformation, access to information, like also more fundamentally. Over the past years, we've also seen people sort of narrowing their circles of trust to familiar and like-minded people often, because let's say if you can't trust beyond just your immediate circle, you retreat to a space of like familiarity, right? And as a result, it can also lead it can also cause people to go from a space of dialogue or interacting with other people to a space of like where they're just looking at shifting more towards like a more low trust space. So with all of this, with like us talking a lot about polarization as well, right? With and the breakdown of reciprocity, like how do we feel like, and the collapse of collective action, like what does that future specifically look like, and how can we sort of move away from move to a slightly more optimistic framing, or what would that look like? So I would really like to like bring like I would really like to bring like Mark in for this in the very beginning, because you have like a background in philosophy and sociology, and we wanted to sort of see like what the most sort of structural change is beyond the surface crisis of AI slop. And also, is this something do you think is fundamental to just technology, or is it something that is also around like that shifting around how societies produce and validate knowledge? So like for example, in like your piece around AI and creative darkness, you talked about how there's just like a volume of production of information, and how that can cause people to think that that means that a person might be inherently knowledgeable as opposed to them not being knowledgeable. So how do we sort of even ascertain like the tag of knowledgeability or trust, and how do you see that perhaps like is that something that's getting fractured? So yeah, would love to hear.
I mean, this is actually the foundational question of sociology on some readings. I mean, the first sociological text, the one that founded it as a discipline, was Emile Durkheim's Suicide, which was about what he termed anomie and the relationship between low trust, hyper individualized states and quite literally suicide. And I think it's interesting to go back to these ideas, firstly, because they show us how we've been here before, that modernity is not a history of stable societies. Modernity is a history of shocks and ruptures and crises. And I think we're now entering another crisis phase, unlike that I've experienced in my lifetime at least. Because ultimately, it's not psychologically sustainable to persist in low trust, hyper individualized states. We're not built to, to survive under those conditions. And individuals do fragment under those conditions. They rupture, they spiral, they begin to lose a sense of meaning or even coherence. But they also form into new forms of collectivity, and many of those are liable to be quite destructive forms. I went down a rabbit hole last year for various reasons, reading about the sociology and social psychology of cults. And I found this so fascinating because the mechanisms that drive people into cults are ones that I think are actually starting to become commonplace. People move into cults when they experience biographical ruptures. There's decades of social psychological research on cults that cannot find individual predictors. There's not a psychological susceptibility to joining a cult. There's how you respond to rupture. If something in your life upends and you have a moment of crisis when your familiar parameters break down, if you then happen to meet a cult recruiter, you are very, very vulnerable. And that is true across class, gender, age, ethnicity. And so I think that's really scary if we think about the cult-like forms that are proliferating through social media and how these can become mechanisms that offer solutions to biographical ruptures. And I think we urgently need to find other forms of offering those solutions. And I found it really heartening in this discussion to hear such a focus on rebuilding trust relationships and the kind of relational embedding. Because as huge as that is, I think that's the only way we're going to be able to get through this. Because I'm also an optimist about the technology, even if it might have sounded like I'm not. I'm a pessimist about how that technology is commercialized. And I was an optimist about social media in the early 2010s. And now I think social media is overwhelmingly a destructive force in society. What's changed is the commercial model. And I worry we're going to see a similar shift in consumer-facing AI in the near future. In terms of the big American consumer-facing models, one of two things is going to happen. The bubble will burst, or Anthropic and OpenAI will go to an initial public offering. In either case, investors will look at the books and say, you cannot keep burning billions of dollars. You need to make this profitable. How are they going to do that? In the same way social media firms did. And so I worry we're about to head over a precipice. And the problems we're seeing now will accelerate rapidly if these firms start using social media mechanisms to optimize for engagement, to increase levels of attachment, to manipulate users. And we're not ready for that. These problems could get worse very quickly. One of the reasons I'm passionate about universities is because they are sites where knowledge is guarded. They are flawed institutions in many, many ways, but sectorally, universities are the custodians of the knowledge system. And I feel at risk of sounding apocalyptic that if universities fall, the rest of society falls. We've got to find a way of negotiating these changes within universities, which means reconfiguring knowledge production to find fundamentally new, more relational, more embedded modes of working with knowledge. Because otherwise, our sense of what is true or false in society, our sense of what can be trusted and what cannot be trusted, I think will break down very rapidly. So I'm really worried about what comes next. And this psychological question is absolutely key. And it's easy to overestimate the significance of the problems we're preoccupied by, and I'm very conscious of that. But the more I've worked on this question of the sociology of consumer-facing AI, the more I see it, this isn't the key to the whole system. This is the inflection point. This is when a lot of pre-existing systemic crises converge in our capacity or lack of capacity to resolve them collectively. Because if we fragment further down this individualized path, I think we'll lose what remaining opportunity we have to kind of get the planetary system heading in a more flourishing direction.
Thank you so much, Mark. Like really resonated with what you were talking about around like relational embedding in particular, and I think that's also like sort of something that is coming up across like the rest of our panel, right? Where relational embedding and what collective solutioning can look like in this space. Also found what you said around just generally like the strengthening of like university spaces in general, right? What does it mean to then reconfigure or retransform what do we even consider as knowledge, and where is that knowledge exactly coming from, and who is it based in is also really important. So at this point, I would also perhaps like to also like bring Sachin in. So Sachin, since you work a lot at like the ecosystem level, right? Like how do we create like an ecosystem, a justice ecosystem that is working well, and also how the system has parts that are interoperable in and of themselves. I wanted to also broadly ask, like, how do you think like a collective trust infrastructure would get transformed now that we're also sort of looking at generative AI as well?
So I think Mark laid out this philosophical basis, right, for where we must move. We must go from, trying to play catch up to trying to get to what are the spaces where trust was embedded, is embedded, can be embedded. Now, whenever people look at this, sometimes they're like, yeah, but, where is innovation is going in this direction or that direction, right? And I think that there is a lack of imagination. And I'll give you an example, right? Let's take an example from the justice sector. Suppose you are a court, a court that deals with, say, property matters. Okay, very simple. You're a court that deals with property matters. Now you start noticing that because of AI, you start getting a whole lot more cases being filed because it's so easy to create a petition and file some infringement, something like you start getting. And then somebody asks you, so what system do you need to build to make that go away, that problem? So your automatic response is some screening system and some AI will do 90% of the work. Here's the problem. You still haven't changed your mindset. You must ask yourself, where are these cases coming from? You must ask yourself, where are those people, right? For instance, if you have panchayats or local government across the country, why not strengthen local government? Why not why not let the court stop at the kind of this? I'm going to retain my model as the place people come to. Why can't the court reimagine itself as the place that goes to the sites, right? So my problem is that we just lack imagination. We are not able to reframe our innovation challenge. And because we're not able to reframe our innovation challenge, there's a disconnect between the academic framing of something and where the investment money goes. The investment money keeps going to the same things because they're like, oh, I get your point, but I don't know where else to put this money. I don't. But if we were to put our money in moving local self-government up, if we were to put our money in increasing universities as investing in, say, not just the university function of classic course delivery, but also as a curator and convener of spaces, we would get the results. But we believe our big financiers and philanthropists, they somehow know where to put the money. I don't think so. I think they're also limited in their imagination. So we have a code switching challenge, honestly. You know.
Thank you so much for that. I think with this now, I think we can move to like the last segment, and then I can open this up to like questions. I think we already have a question in the chat. So given everything that we've discussed, what would rebuilding look like? And I think you've already hinted at this. But like beyond individual responsibility versus like platform regulation, because that is also something we talked about, right? Like AI labeling, and what kind of specific structural interventions can we imagine, and can we build for like reciprocity rather than just like verification, which will then just go into surveillance? And what would credible trust look like, and what would credible trust brokers look like in your domains? So I would really like to bring like Juni in for this. So for example, like something that your like sort of algorithmic system work also showed is that like when there's an opacity in the system, that is a space that breeds a lot of lack of trust and breeds a lot of like inequality, especially when it comes to like, let's say, platform workers. So like when you think of designing like sort of information systems that preserve trust rather than just like extract from it, what principles do you think would matter most, and can they scale to like more like national level ecosystems in Southeast Asia?
Sorry, I was muted. I was just nodding furiously to what everybody else was saying. So I think that a lot has actually been covered very, very well by other panelists. I will just like maybe highlight parts where I think bits that I think are important. I think firstly, information system design is really the crux of the problem. And we've been optimizing for different things. Things that are not necessarily good for society. Because of profit making and things like that. I don't need to belabor the point. But that does point us to a crucial thing, which is that we can design systems that optimize for different priorities, right? So like and I really like Sachin's point on the lack of imagination, because that's exactly what I think a lot actually, on how, why don't we make systems that actually optimize for instance, consensus instead of, argument. And that, I don't know if you guys know, but there's already some social media such as poll.is, which is doing exactly that, right? To try to build policy based on consensus, you need to put in certain affordances and take out certain affordances. So you need to sort of put in like friction, so people don't flood the whole thing with their inane opinions. You need to take out comments so that people don't fight in the comment section instead of doing, productive deliberation. So definitely the technology should be thoughtfully designed. I also very much agree with previous points on how we definitely need to invest more in institutions and community networks and things like that. And this is also drawing from the work that I've done on platform workers, right? In that they are individualized, atomized workers, but however, they do organize within themselves, right? There are informal WhatsApp groups that they form to sort of exchange information, keep each other awake, that sort of stuff. And then there's also formal organizations, NGOs, umbrella national organizations that then represent them, politically. So all of that is happening, and all of that is happening at their individual level. So if we could actually invest in those, And that's where you build trust, right? It comes from interaction. It doesn't come from apps, as somebody had already mentioned. So I think there's also importance in differentiating between trust and trustworthiness. So we can try, and I think most of the conversation has been about building trustworthiness. And I am all for that, right? We need trustworthy systems. We need to increase transparency. We need to increase labeling. We need to increase accountability. All of those are super, super important. But I think that the conversation on trust, however, is not that not that vibrant. No one's really talking about that. What do you mean by trust at several different levels, interpersonal and societal, as you have differentiated? All of those have to be sort of broken down and then debated, and then technology has to be built based on those things, right? So yeah, let me just quickly look at my points to see if I have anything else I want to talk about. One last thing on AI agents, which is I was listening to a podcaster the other day, and he was suggesting something along the lines of license plate numbers when it comes to AI agents, which I thought was a very interesting idea. And something that promotes like accountability, right? You can't just release an AI agent out there and it does something and you're like, I don't know, you sort of gotta rein in that agent of yours. So I think that is gonna be more on the trustworthy side. But at the same time, if you get more trustworthiness, you get more trust. So I don't think these two are, separate things. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Preeti. I think definitely I love the analogy about putting license plate numbers on like AI agents. I think that's definitely gonna stay with me. But also just like your broader point around like trust versus trustworthiness. And so here I also wanted to bring Antaraa in. So like Antaraa, you've described your work as building like a process and not an organization. We've also been talking about like building trust in the process, right? Like that the process will get me to an outcome. I also wanted to perhaps like ask you like what makes civic processes like trust preserving, and which of those elements do we think we need to amplify more?
Thanks, Diksha. Really wonderful question there. So, yes, the idea is that there is a lot of trust that requires to be preserved in public institutions and in the way that we engage with government systems. Fundamentally, there is no easy answer to this to say X, Y, or Z. But I think one of the big things is actually the follow through. It's not so much in the process itself at the immediate time that you apply for an entitlement, a benefit, or comment on a draft law. It's actually the process of the follow through that builds a lot of trust. The other factor is that, and we see this happening a lot in urban local governments in India as well, that you have a face-to-face mechanism of being able to engage and really get your entitlements if something is stuck in the system, right? So what we've seen a lot of is, let's say, for example, if somebody's applied for a ration card and not received it, the system to apply might be digitized, but they always know that they can go to their elected representative, and their elected representative will have the incentive to help them out with making sure that that process happens through. So it's layered, there is built-in accountability, and it's really more than anything about the follow through, not just the initial engagement.
Yeah, just to follow up like to that, like I think you've mentioned like the follow through I think was coming out a lot in your answer. So I was just wanted to probe a little bit around like what would building for follow through look like? Like, is there something that we can do as a design principle that might help the follow through as opposed to just like a claim that this will be followed?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So responsiveness really builds that follow through. And you can say that it's two sides of the same coin, but the idea really is that how do we equip our systems to be able to deal with input at scale, right? And input could be in the form of forms filled now through AI at a much faster pace. So the ration cards also have to be issued at a much faster pace. Or alternatively, in my line of work, it could be a lot more feedback being gathered, and a lot more citizens actually watching on these government bodies to say, okay, what will they do next? Will they follow through? So end to end, the entire process, right, from application to outcome, needs to be streamlined in such a manner that it becomes easy for governments to be responsive as well. I think, again, coming back to social media, why it was seen to be something that was really, really dangerous and detrimental was because it was not in government process. The government had to build processes around responding to Twitter complaints, around kind of engaging with citizens on social media. Instead, if you can strengthen the government's internal processes, then it becomes easier for them to not have to go outside and try and solve for some of these key and critical issues, right? So those are some of the benchmarks that it's worth sort of investing in and developing as well.
Yeah, thank you so much for that really, really thoughtful answer. And I do definitely see the different parts sort of connecting and like also just like the end-to-end process that you described. I do want to pivot a little bit to Mark, and this is a little bit of a departure from what we've been talking about, but this is just generally something that I also wanted to ask is that like in like your work around like generative AI for academics, you've talked about like let's say how AI can be a thinking partner rather than like a substitute for thought. And like even over the course of this conversation, we've also been talking about how like AI in and of itself may not necessarily be the problem. So here, like how can we sort of embed sort of authenticity in like processes rather than just like looking at the like policing the output and also how can this like sort of also maybe translate beyond just like educational spaces like just thoughts.
There's clearly a place here for a more politicized notion of digital literacy or digital well-being. And so my experience of using LLMs, Claude in particular, is that they're incredibly conducive to creative thought. But that's because I'm someone who already writes a lot. And if you have a lot of cultural capital and you like writing, if you just write long form to them, you get long form writing back. And the problem is that cultural capital, the capacity to write fluently and confidently using a kind of range of symbols, is, clearly not evenly distributed. And so I think I was a bit naive in many respects because I didn't really account for how specific my experience was. But that raises the educational question of how do you create the conditions which make it easier for people to think with AI rather than using it as a substitute for thought? And I think part of that is understanding it as a spectrum. There's a pedagogical idea that I'm very enthusiastic about, which is that you need to shift left, as the author puts it, Jonathan Jackson at Queen Mary's in London. So you can use AI in quite intense ways, but we need to inculcate in ourselves and our students that when we begin to look to it, we're always trying to shift into less intensive use. So if we look to it to answer a question, we don't keep looking to it to answer a question. We let it inform our deliberation, and then we move on. And it's a specific example of, I think, a broader challenge, which is how we can learn to live well with these systems. I think the commercialization pressures are going to make that harder, but that, if anything, makes it more urgent. I mean, I come back to social media. My reading of like a very vast literature, which I think is multifaceted, but I don't think it's too simplistic to say the literature suggests a majority of social media users feel uncomfortable with their own use of social media. And I think how we got there is really interesting. Most social media users I know can happily recite critiques of algorithmic filtering, of kind of the addictiveness of it. And yet we're often stuck in it. I've spent the last year trying to give up social media. And, I use the term give up in a kind of addiction register because it is very addictive. And I think we can learn a lot from how things went wrong with our culture around social media. And in universities, there's evidence that students want to have conversations about this. They want to talk to academic staff about how we can use these systems well, rather than be dominated by them. And I do wonder increasingly if finding ways to facilitate those conversations can in itself build trust, because we are in a shared situation where a technology is developing rapidly and we don't know how to integrate it successfully into our lives. And to talk about our own uncertainty and to share personal experiences, can be a way of establishing a common ground in relation to this. And again, I feel we have to do this urgently because I'm much less worried about AI now than many AI critics are. But I think I'm possibly more worried about where it might be in 5 years' time. Because the transition that I keep coming back to is Twitter. Compare Twitter in 2010 to Elon Musk's X in 2026. And I think we will see a similar scale of transition on a much faster timescale with consumer-facing AI platforms. And we need to develop this, begin to develop the conditions for a collective conversation about it that works urgently, I think. And that's one way through the challenges that universities face, but I think it has wider implications.
Thank you so much. And I think I really resonate well with like what you said around like the collective and sort of what that collective space could look like. And then like final like question from me, and then we can open up to the audience. To Sachin, so since like a lot of your work has also, and like a lot of the conversation we've been having has also been around like the power of the collective. What in your specific experience has like actually like built trust that like lasted over like a longer period of time? And yeah, I think then we can like open to audience after that.
Yeah, I think, I think that a lot of that our work with building collectives, I think plural is better maybe than a collective, has been really recognizing the, first of all, trusting that people want to be in relationship, and that that relationship can change. Sometimes it can be highly collaborative, sometimes it can be slightly competitive, sometimes it can be co-creative, but people want to be in relationship. And then also trusting that you have to create the rites of passage. You have to create the many touch points that result in relationships being built slowly over a long period of time. So I think first of all, I will say we look at our work as long work, long work that will, we've been around for 8 years now, and we see our work if we as necessary work for life, right? Why? Because what we are really dealing with is systematic breakdown in ability to communicate, ability to share. We are dealing with that. We are dealing with the fact that you may come from the same place, let's say a place in the Himalayas, and so you deeply love the place, but you self-identify in a way that with your disagreements, right? I am a government officer, I focus on this, and this is a civil society organization, and they are doing that. But so the moment you drop beneath the identity of a civil society, a government officer and a civil society organization, instinctively you can drop to the core, which is everything, the place, the history, all of that. So there's so much of latent trust. There's so much to relate. World is a very shallow interaction. There's almost no touch point at the depth. So if you keep touching and keep going deeper, you can create high trust collectives over a long period of time. They don't need MOUs. They don't need, because they are bound by their rediscovering their shared music. They are bound by rediscovering their shared, journeys as families, whatever. So Diksha, I don't think our work is some grand answer to anything, but our work has taught us one thing, that we need to really make a deep commitment to do community building and collective building, and restore that trust. And this needs to be done at a movement scale. If earlier on the movement was the Bhudan movement to get people to commit their property from the individual landlord to the collective, we need another movement to restore our relationships, to just bring together, to find ways to shift the conversation from more, let's have a discussion on this, because that's not achieving anything unless you're able to touch one level lower, touch another level lower, touch a level. This is why I believe that even spiritual movements are so critical in our day and age, right? You have to go deeper. So I know there's an easy answer, ecosystem of innovation and how this is going to drive quality of ideas, and I can give you that answer. But at a very fundamental level, it's restoring our ability to be with each other, and we are doing that in one field, but I think that needs to be done in a very wide. I would say, doesn't matter what your day job is. Can your evening job be restoring trust? That's the way I think people should look at it.
All right. Thank you so much for that really wonderful answer. I think there's a question in the chat that I think Nirat left. So Nirat, would you like to ask it, or should I let you know?
Yeah, thanks, Diksha. So my question, it's more about institutional trust. So a lot of the discussion has focused on both aspects, but my question is specifically about institutional trust. So at one level, trust is a cognitive shortcut, right? Because if you trust an institution, you don't need to evaluate the signals that that institution is generating again. And you don't need to worry about whether the health insurance program your employer has offered is the best program for you, or policy has been well thought. So it's a cognitive shortcut. Now, one of the things that AI Slop is doing is that it's creating a multiplicity of options, right? It's enabling different kinds of actors to emanate different kinds of signals, right? So, and when we have a diversity of ideas that we are getting exposed to, it becomes very difficult to anchor on one idea, and cognition, sort of the cognitive load increases, right? So, and logically, trust then becomes sort of a little brittle. You don't know who to trust if you have two different pieces of advice coming to you about, okay, whether this program, that program is better. So do you have a sense of, have you first of all seen this happen already? Is there a discussion happening around this, especially in the B2B space, in the governmental space, government civil society kind of space? And what themes are emerging? Anyone who'd like to answer? Yeah.
I'll just take a first stab, and then would love to hear everybody else's thoughts as well. Ninath, I think that's a very interesting question, and one of the big issues that we are also trying to grapple with is that how do you deal with a certain syntheticization of the lived experience of the citizen when by the time it goes to the government as well, right? I feel like there are a lot of different problems that are worth paying attention to, but very fundamentally, I find that we're not doing enough to define who governs these systems and what are the boundary conditions for that governance. And by governance, I don't mean regulation. I mean facilitative architectures for us to be able to have deeper conversations between government, civil society, between government and citizen, and between all of these different, or even governments and governments, right? That sort of, again, to Mark's point about being more individualistic, we're also at a commons level starting to lose sight of how we can create these guardrails and conditions for us to communicate more effectively. And that's something that I feel like needs a little bit of urgent attention. So it's not a trend per se that we are seeing right now, but it is something that will help create the boundary conditions for us to do more and do better in this space.
So I want to just add a very quick one, and because I know that we have 2 minutes. I was reading about AI curation and I cannot remember where the source was, but the study actually indicated that AI LLMs actually prefer LLM generated content. So you kind of have like a situation where, because if I read your question correctly, where to direct our attention towards is a curation problem, right? And if AI ends up curating what we read and it prefers AI generated content, then that's kind of the answer there.
Thanks, Jenny. Yeah. Back to you, Diksha. Sorry.
No, I think Mark had his hand up. Mark, do you want to go?
Yeah, just to say, I think that's a fascinating point, and it makes me think about my experiments with trying to get reading recommendations from LLMs. And in my experience, they're really bad at it. And they do it so confidently and they do it so fluently, but the recommendations are terrible. And a kind of a classic algorithmic recommendation system, people who like this book also like this one, is far better for choosing books because it's parasitic upon human judgment. The LLMs are trying to perform judgment that they're fundamentally unable to make. And so I think there is a real risk that we insert LLMs into processes that they're just not designed for. They're very good for certain things, they are very bad at others. But because they are so fluent and so confident, it's very hard to distinguish between the two. And questions of recommendation, I just don't think they'll ever be able to do adequately. I do think LLM curation is an idea that will not lead anywhere useful and possibly to places quite destructive.
So thank you so much for that thought, Mark. I think now we're at time. So, we know that you also have to get to a meeting, so I'll just wrap this up. So thank you so much to our very, very lovely panelists for contributing their thoughts. And this has genuinely given us a lot to think about around trust building, around what it means, the kind of stakes it has, and how we can also imagine more alternatives and what would design even look like in this space. And yeah, so one thing I wanted to say before we leave is that something that we're also curating and also launching on the 28th is an open source, freely accessible archive of people's experiences with Slop, which is called the Museum of Slop. So if any of you want to contribute to it, I think one of our team members will be putting like the link in the chat, and we'd love it if you could contribute. You could just voice record and then add anything to it. So yeah, thank you so much again, and hope you have a lovely rest of the day.